People stop seeing cleaners after the first week. That's something I learned very quickly in America. At first it hurt, then eventually it became useful. By the time I started working nights on the 42nd floor of Blackstone Financial Group, most employees looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. The woman with the gray cleaning cart, the quiet Asian immigrant, the one wiping fingerprints from glass walls after midnight while people in tailored suits discuss numbers large enough to buy entire neighborhoods. Nobody asked questions, and I preferred it that way. Every evening at 6:30, I tied my dark hair into a low knot, put on my Navy maintenance uniform, clipped my ID badge to my pocket, and entered the building through the employee service entrance behind the parking garage. The security guard downstairs barely looked up anymore. "Evening, May." "Evening." That was usually the longest conversation I had all night. I cleaned conference rooms, executive offices, kitchens, elevators, bathrooms, silent work, predictable work, safe work, or at least, that's what I told myself. Outside the giant windows, Manhattan glowed endlessly in silver and gold. Inside, the office remained cold even after everyone left. Sometimes I wondered whether powerful people created that atmosphere intentionally. Cold offices, cold lighting, cold conversations. Maybe warmth made honesty easier, and honesty was dangerous in buildings like this. That Thursday night began like every other. Rain tapped softly against the skyscraper windows while most employees rushed home before the storm became worse. I pushed my cart slowly down the executive hallway, listening to the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Then I heard laughter coming from conference room C. That meant another late meeting. I sighed internally. Late meetings always meant extra messes. Coffee stains, food containers, wine glasses, crumbs pressed into expensive carpets. As I approached the room, the glass doors slid open suddenly. A blonde woman in heels nearly walked straight into me. "Oh, sorry." She barely glanced at my face before speaking into her headset again. "Tell Richard the Shanghai investors are already waiting on Zoom." Shanghai. The word made something shift inside my chest automatically, not emotionally anymore, more like muscle memory. The woman turned back toward the room irritably. "Where's Daniel? We still don't have a translator." Another man answered from inside. "He's stuck at JFK." "Fantastic," she muttered. Then her eyes landed on me again, specifically on my face. A strange expression crossed her features. Recognition. "You're Chinese, right?" The hallway became very quiet. I kept both hands on the cleaning cart. "Yes." The woman looked back into the conference room, then suddenly laughed. "Well, maybe our cleaner can save the quarter." Several people inside chuckled. I lowered my eyes politely. The secretary waved dismissively. "Relax, I'm joking." But she wasn't fully joking. I had worked around wealthy Americans long enough to recognize the difference. To them, people like me existed in categories first: cleaner, immigrant, Asian woman. Individual identity came later, if ever. Before I could continue walking away, another voice called out sharply from inside the room. "Wait!" The room fell silent instantly. I looked up. A tall man stood near the far end of the conference table, one hand resting against a leather chair. Richard Bennett, CEO of Blackstone Financial Group. I knew who he was the same way everyone in the building did. The man from financial magazines, television interviews, Forbes lists, expensive watch, controlled smile, perfect silver hair. But his eyes were what people noticed most. Sharp eyes. Careful eyes, eyes that evaluated everything. And right now, they were evaluating me. "Do you actually speak Mandarin?" he asked. His tone wasn't mocking, it was cautious. I answered calmly, "Yes." The secretary smirked. "See? Problem solved." Another round of light laughter moved around the room, but Richard Bennett never smiled. He kept watching me carefully. "Mainland or Cantonese?" "Mainland," I answered. That changed something instantly. I saw it happen across his face, tiny, almost invisible, but real. One of the investors on the screen spoke impatiently through the conference speakers. Fast Mandarin, corporate vocabulary, northern accent. Without thinking, I understood every word. The secretary looked stressed. "What did he say?" I hesitated. The old instinct returned immediately. Stay invisible. Invisible people survive. But Richard Bennett was still watching me. Finally, I translated quietly. "He said they're tired of waiting and want confirmation before transferring the second payment tonight." Silence hit the room, not because of my translation, because of my accent. Perfect Beijing pronunciation, not immigrant English mixed with survival Mandarin, educated Mandarin, executive-level Mandarin. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Someone near the back of the room whispered, "What?" The secretary blinked twice. Richard Bennett slowly straightened his posture. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 8 months. "And before that?" The question lingered strangely in the air. I should have lied, but exhaustion makes people careless. "I worked in financial translation in Shanghai." No one spoke. Even the investors on screen had gone quiet now. Richard's face became unreadable. Then the speaker system crackled again. One of the Chinese investors spoke rapidly, too rapidly for most Americans to follow, but I caught every word. And suddenly, the blood drained from my face because the investor wasn't discussing quarterly projections anymore. He was asking about missing money, specifically money connected to an account that technically did not exist. I looked toward Richard instinctively and realized immediately he understood Mandarin too, not fluently, but enough. Enough to know exactly what had just been said. For one terrifying second, our eyes locked across the conference room, and in that moment, Richard Bennett stopped looking at me like a cleaner. He looked at me like a threat. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rain continued tapping softly against the skyscraper windows while the investors on the screen waited in tense silence. Richard Bennett never looked away from me, and suddenly I understood something dangerous. The translation itself wasn't the problem. The problem was that I understood too much. The secretary finally broke the silence nervously. "So, what did he say?" I should have simplified it. That would have been safer for everyone. But years ago, before America, before night shifts and cleaning carts, before learning how invisible women survive, I had built my entire career around precision. In financial translation, one incorrect word could destroy companies or lives. I kept my eyes on the conference screen. He asked why the offshore account still hasn't been cleared. The room became still again. One man near the far end of the table immediately straightened in his chair. Another quietly closed his laptop. Tiny reactions, but I noticed them. Invisible people learn to observe details because details are often the only protection they have. The secretary frowned. "Offshore account?" Richard answered before I could speak. "Internal transfer issue." His voice came quickly, smoothly, too smoothly. Then he looked at me again. "Thank you, Ms. Lin Mei-Lin." For a brief second, something strange crossed his expression. Recognition. Not from tonight. Older. Buried. But before I could process it, he smiled politely. "We may need your assistance for a few minutes." The room shifted awkwardly. One of the younger executives laughed quietly. "Well, this is unexpected." Nobody else laughed with him, because the atmosphere had changed. People feel danger before they understand it, and right now, something in that room felt dangerous. Richard motioned toward an empty chair near the wall. "Please." I hesitated. Everything inside me said, "Leave," immediately. But refusing a CEO directly inside a room full of executives would attract attention, and attention was the one thing I had spent years avoiding. So I slowly moved toward the chair and sat down quietly beside the conference screen. The secretary handed me a headset. "Just summarize the important parts." I nodded once. The investor on screen began speaking again, fast, sharp, aggressive. The kind of Mandarin used when wealthy men stop pretending to be polite. As I translated, I noticed several executives exchange nervous looks. Investor: "We transferred the first payment 3 weeks ago." Me: "He says the first transfer was confirmed 3 weeks ago." Investor: "Your people promised the second channel would already be operational." Me: "He says they expected the second account structure to be active by now." Richard leaned slightly forward. "Tell them we're handling complications internally." I translated carefully. The investor answered instantly, and this time, my stomach tightened, because his tone changed completely, cold, accusing. He spoke one name slowly: Zhao Wen. The moment the name left the speaker system, Richard Bennett froze, not visibly to most people, but I saw it. His fingers tightened once against the conference table. Tiny movement, controlled immediately, but real. The investor continued speaking rapidly, and now every word felt heavier. "He says Zhao Wen disappeared after the Singapore transfer." Nobody in the room moved. One executive near the windows quietly removed his glasses. Another stared directly at Richard. The secretary looked confused now. "What's happening?" No one answered her, because everyone suddenly understood the meeting had stopped being routine. I swallowed carefully before continuing the translation. "He says their partners are becoming nervous because Zhao Wen controlled the verification documents." Richard interrupted sharply. "That's enough." The sudden force in his voice shocked the room. He immediately softened it. "We'll continue the sensitive portions privately." The investor on screen frowned, then answered coldly in Mandarin. "Who is the woman translating?" Richard looked at me. For one strange moment, the room felt suspended, like everyone instinctively understood this conversation mattered more than quarterly investments. I answered before Richard could. "My name is Mei Lin." The investor stared at the screen silently. Then slowly his expression changed. Recognition. Actual recognition. He leaned closer toward the camera and quietly asked me in Mandarin, "Beijing International Finance Bureau?" My chest tightened instantly. I hadn't heard those words spoken aloud in years. The room around me disappeared for a second. Memories returned sharply. Glass towers in Shanghai, late nights reviewing contracts, conference rooms filled with government auditors, my husband laughing beside me over takeout noodles at midnight. A completely different life. A life before grief destroyed everything. I answered carefully, "Yes." The investor looked stunned, then suspicious. "What are you doing there?" I could feel every executive in the room watching me now. I lowered my eyes slightly. "I work maintenance." Silence. Even through the screen, the investor looked confused by the answer, because people who once worked inside international finance systems do not usually disappear into janitorial work in New York skyscrapers, unless something terrible happened or they were hiding. The investor slowly leaned back in his chair, Then he said something that made the blood drain from my face. "Does Richard Bennett know who your husband was?" The room went completely silent. Richard stood up instantly. "That's enough for tonight." But it was too late, because every person in that room had heard the question, and more importantly, they saw Richard panic before anyone else understood why. The investor continued angrily in Mandarin. "Your husband warned our department about those transfers before he died." My hands became cold. No, not here, not now. I hadn't heard anyone mention Jian's name in almost 4 years. Not since the investigation, not since the accident, not since the funeral where half the people avoided looking me in the eyes. Richard's voice became dangerously calm. "End the call." Nobody moved immediately. The secretary looked terrified now. "Richard, now." The screen suddenly went black. Silence crashed into the conference room. Heavy, suffocating. Every executive looked either frightened or confused. I sat frozen beside the screen while old memories pushed violently back into my mind. Jian standing beside our apartment window in Shanghai. Jian whispering, "If anything happens, trust nobody connected to the transfers." Jian grabbing my hand 2 nights before he died. Fear in his eyes. Real fear. At the time, I thought he was exhausted from work. Now, sitting inside a Manhattan skyscraper beside one of America's most powerful financial executives, I realized something horrifying. My husband may not have died in an accident at all, and Richard Bennett knew it. Nobody left the conference room after the call ended. That was the first thing I noticed. Powerful people usually pretend everything is normal when situations become dangerous. But now, even pretending had become difficult. The executives sat frozen around the long, black conference table while rain continued streaking down the windows behind them. No one looked at me directly anymore, and somehow that frightened me more than their attention had. Because people only avoid eye contact when they suddenly realize someone has become dangerous to know. Richard Bennett stood near the head of the table with both hands pressed lightly against the polished surface. Calm posture, controlled breathing, but his eyes had changed completely. The polished corporate warmth was gone now. What remained underneath looked colder, older, more calculating. Finally, one of the executives spoke quietly. "Richard, what the hell was that?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. "How much Mandarin do you understand exactly?" The question sounded calm, too calm. I understood instantly. This was no longer about translation. This was damage control. I forced myself to answer evenly. "Enough." A dangerous response. I saw several people exchange glances immediately. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Enough for what? I should have lied again. But something inside me had started shifting ever since Jian's name was spoken aloud. For 4 years, I had buried entire parts of myself just to survive. My career, my language, my memories. Now suddenly, all of it stood alive again inside this room. I understood the conversation. Silence. One executive muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ." The secretary still looked confused. "Can someone please explain what's happening?" Richard finally turned toward the others. Ms. Lin previously worked in international finance compliance. The room shifted instantly. People looked at me differently now, not as staff, not as invisible, as risk. I hated how quickly respect appeared once status entered the conversation. One older executive frowned. "Why is someone with that background cleaning offices?" A fair question, one I had spent years avoiding. Before I could answer, Richard spoke smoothly. "Personal tragedy, immigration complications." Again, controlled information, minimal truth, maximum narrative management. My stomach tightened. He was already shaping the room. That meant he was afraid. The older executive looked uncomfortable now. We should probably continue this tomorrow. Yes, another agreed quickly, but nobody stood up, because nobody wanted to be the first person leaving a room full of uncertainty. Richard finally straightened and buttoned his suit jacket slowly. Then he looked at me. "Ms. Lin, may I speak with you privately?" Every instinct inside me screamed no, but refusing publicly would create even more danger, and the truth was, I needed answers too. So I nodded once. The executives began leaving quietly, avoiding conversation. The secretary hurried out first without looking at anyone. One younger analyst glanced back at me before exiting. Not pity, fear. Within less than 20 minutes, the giant conference room emptied completely. Only Richard and I remained, and suddenly the silence felt enormous. The city lights shimmered across the windows behind him, while thunder rolled softly somewhere over Manhattan. Richard loosened his tie slowly. For the first time all evening, he looked human, older than before, tired. "You should have told someone who you were," he said quietly. I stared at him. I was a translator, not a criminal. His eyes darkened slightly. "That depends who you worked for." The sentence landed heavily between us. I folded my arms tightly. My husband worked for anti-corruption investigations. Something flickered across Richard's face again. Recognition. Real recognition this time. "Yes," he said softly. "I know." Cold spread through my body. "You knew Jian?" Richard walked slowly toward the window overlooking the city. "Only professionally." I stood motionless beside the conference table. The cleaning cart still remained near the doorway. Mop bucket, spray bottles, paper towels, an invisible woman's armor. And suddenly I felt absurd standing there in maintenance clothes while discussing my dead husband with one of the richest men in New York. Richard kept his back turned toward me. "Your husband caused serious problems for several people." Anger rose instantly through my chest. He was trying to expose illegal transfers. Richard gave a faint, humorless smile toward the glass. "Everyone always believes they're the ethical side." I stared at him in disbelief. "My husband died." Richard turned back slowly. "Yes." Nothing else. No sympathy. No apology. Just acknowledgement. That frightened me more than cruelty would have, because emotionally detached people are often capable of terrible things without seeing themselves as monsters. I took a slow breath. The investor said Jian warned people before he died. Richard's expression became unreadable again. He did. My pulse quickened painfully. Warn them about what? Silence. Thunder rumbled softly outside. Richard studied me carefully before answering. About money moving through accounts tied to governments, shell corporations, and private investment channels. I swallowed hard. And Blackstone. Another pause. Then quietly, Blackstone was one of many companies involved. The room suddenly felt colder. I remembered nights in Shanghai when Jian came home exhausted but distracted. Moments when he checked the apartment locks twice before sleeping. The night he whispered, "If anything happens to me, disappear." At the time, I thought stress had made him paranoid. Now my hands were trembling. Richard noticed immediately. "You didn't know everything, did you?" "No." The answer came out smaller than I intended. Richard sighed softly. Jian tried to stop something much larger than he understood. Anger returned instantly. "You talk about him like he made a mistake." "He did." The sharpness in Richard's response shocked me. For the first time all evening, real emotion entered his voice. He believed exposing corruption automatically made the world safer. Richard stepped closer slowly. But when billions move through international systems, idealism becomes dangerous. I stared at him. You sound like you admired him. A strange silence followed. Then Richard answered quietly, I respected him. That unsettled me deeply, because respect spoken in that tone can sometimes sound very close to regret. I looked toward the dark conference screen. Did someone kill my husband? The question hung heavily in the room. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down briefly at the table. And suddenly, for the first time that night, he seemed genuinely exhausted. When he finally spoke, his voice had become lower, careful, measured. The official report said it was a car accident. My chest tightened painfully. That's not what I asked. Another silence, longer this time. Then Richard lifted his eyes toward me and quietly said the sentence that changed everything. May, if your husband's death wasn't accidental. He paused. Then you were never supposed to still be alive either. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. The city lights beyond the conference room windows blurred while Richard Bennett's words echoed through my head. You were never supposed to still be alive either. I stared at him across the massive table, unable to move. The rain outside had become heavier now, streaking violently down the glass as thunder rolled somewhere above Manhattan. What does that mean? I whispered. Richard didn't answer immediately. That silence terrified me more than any explanation could have, because people only hesitate like that when the truth is dangerous. I felt my hands tightening around the edge of the chair beside me. My husband died in a car accident. Richard finally looked away. Yes. Again, that same answer. Careful, minimal, controlled. Anger rose sharply through my chest. You keep saying the official story instead of the truth. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, then walked toward the small bar counter near the conference room wall. Without asking, he poured himself water into a crystal glass. His hand looked steady, too steady. You need to understand something, May, he said quietly. International financial investigations don't work the way ordinary people imagine. Ordinary people. The phrase instantly irritated me. My husband wasn't ordinary. No, Richard admitted softly. He wasn't. That answer hurt unexpectedly, because there was no mockery in it, only something close to admiration, and somehow that made everything more disturbing. Richard leaned one hand against the counter. Gian was intelligent, ethical, persistent. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face, which made him extremely dangerous. I stared at him. To criminals? Richard lifted his eyes toward me slowly, to everyone. The room became still again. I remembered Gian sitting at our kitchen table in Shanghai, surrounded by documents late at night. His tie loosened, coffee growing cold beside him, eyes exhausted but focused. Back then, I believed corruption investigations were simple. Good people exposing bad people. Now I suddenly understood how naive that had been. Richard spoke carefully. When money moves between governments, banks, shell corporations, political interests, and private investors, there are no clean sides anymore. My stomach tightened. You were involved. Every major financial institution was involved somehow. That's not an answer. No, he agreed quietly. It isn't. Thunder shook softly through the windows. I could hear my heartbeat now. Slow, heavy, uneasy. Richard took a sip of water before continuing. Your husband discovered accounts connected to unauthorized transfers through Singapore and Hong Kong. The names hit me instantly. I remembered those cities appearing repeatedly in Gian's late-night files. At the time, I barely paid attention, because married life teaches people dangerous habits. You trust the person beside you to carry burdens you don't fully understand. Now guilt spread slowly through me. Maybe I should have listened harder. Richard continued. The problem wasn't just the money. Then what was it? He hesitated again. That hesitation frightened me immediately. Finally, he answered, the people attached to the accounts. Cold moved through my chest. What people? Richard's eyes locked onto mine. People powerful enough that investigations quietly disappear. I swallowed hard. You mean politicians? Among others. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. I remembered Jian waking suddenly one night almost 3 years before his death after his phone rang at 2 a.m. He went into the hallway to answer quietly, but I still heard part of the conversation, then shut it down before someone gets hurt. At the time, I thought he meant financial consequences. Now nausea rolled through my stomach. Maybe he meant something much worse. I looked at Richard carefully. Why are you telling me this? For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely tired. Because your presence here tonight changes things. I frowned. How? Richard set the glass down slowly. Most people connected to Jian's investigation believed you disappeared permanently after his death. I felt confusion spreading through me. I did disappear. Yes, Richard said quietly, and that probably saved your life. The room fell silent again. My mind returned to the months after Jian died, leaving Shanghai, selling almost everything, ignoring calls from former colleagues, changing apartments twice after arriving in New York. At the time, grief explained everything. Now fear began rearranging those memories differently. Had I been hiding without realizing it? Richard moved toward the conference table again. Who knew you worked here? Almost nobody. Good. The speed of his response unsettled me immediately. Why? Instead of answering, Richard asked another question. Did anyone contact you after Jian's death? I hesitated, then slowly nodded. One man. Richard's entire posture sharpened instantly. What man? I never learned his name. The memory returned vividly now. 3 weeks after the funeral, a black car parked outside our apartment building in Shanghai. A man waiting beside it. Gray coat. No umbrella despite the rain. He approached me quietly and handed me a business card with no company name. Then he said something I never forgot. Your husband trusted systems that do not protect people. At the time, I thought grief had made the conversation surreal. Now every word felt horrifyingly clear. Richard's expression darkened as I described him. Did he threaten you? No. What did he want? I looked toward the rain-covered windows. He told me to leave China immediately. Richard became very still. And you listened. Yes. Another long silence followed. Then Richard rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw, almost frustrated. That means someone inside the network tried to protect you. My pulse quickened. What network? Richard gave a faint, bitter laugh. The same network your husband accidentally threatened. I stared at him. You keep talking like this is some invisible organization. In a way, Richard said quietly. That's exactly what it is. Fear crawled slowly through my body now. Not dramatic fear. Something worse. The kind that grows quietly when reality becomes larger than your ability to understand it. I folded my arms tightly. Then why am I safe now? Richard looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time that night, his answer sounded completely honest. I'm not sure you are. A chill moved through me instantly. Then suddenly, the conference room doors opened. Both of us turned sharply. A security guard stepped inside, looking uneasy. "Mr. Bennett." Richard's expression hardened immediately. "What is it?" The guard hesitated, then looked directly at me. "There's a man downstairs asking for her." The room went cold. Richard's face changed instantly. "Name?" The guard swallowed nervously. "He didn't give one." My heart started pounding violently. Richard stepped toward the guard fast. "What does he look like?" "Older Asian man. Gray coat." Everything inside me stopped, because I knew exactly who it was before the guard finished speaking. The man from Shanghai, the one who warned me to disappear. And somehow, after 4 years, he had finally found me again. For a moment, nobody moved. The security guard stood frozen near the conference room doors, while rain hammered against the windows hard enough to sound like static. Richard Bennett's face lost all remaining color, and that frightened me more than anything else had tonight, because powerful men do not panic easily, especially men like Richard. "Where is he now?" Richard asked quietly. The guard swallowed. "In the main lobby." "Did he give a reason for asking about her?" "No, sir." Richard looked at me immediately. Every trace of corporate polish had vanished now. Only calculation remained. "Did anyone know you were here tonight?" "No." "Think carefully." I said no. But even as the words left my mouth, uncertainty crawled through me, because New York suddenly felt much smaller than before. Smaller, closer, watching. Richard walked toward the doors quickly. "Don't let him leave." The guard nodded and disappeared into the hallway. The moment the doors closed again, Richard turned back toward me sharply. "You need to listen to me very carefully now." Something in his tone made my chest tighten instantly. Not authority, urgency, real urgency. I stared at him across the room. "You know who he is?" "Yes." "Who?" Richard hesitated only briefly this time. "His name is Chen Guoliang." The name hit me like cold water. I had never heard it before, but somehow it still sounded familiar, like hearing the missing piece of a memory you were never supposed to complete. Richard continued quietly. "He used to work inside financial enforcement operations connected to state investigations." I frowned. "You mean law enforcement?" Richard gave a faint, humorless smile. "Not exactly." That answer unsettled me immediately. Nothing tonight had simple definitions. Not governments, not corporations, not loyalty, and certainly not safety. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself. Why would he be looking for me after 4 years? Richard looked directly into my eyes, because something started moving again. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. What does that mean? Instead of answering immediately, Richard stepped closer to the conference table and lowered his voice. "The accounts your husband investigated disappeared after his death." I stared at him. Disappeared? Frozen, buried, hidden. Thunder rolled across the skyline again. "But tonight," Richard continued, "those investors confirmed the transfers restarted." A chill moved slowly down my spine. "You think someone reopened the system?" "I know they did." The certainty in his voice terrified me. I suddenly remembered Jian sitting silently beside our apartment window one winter night in Shanghai. No television, no music, just darkness beyond the glass. I had asked him what was wrong, and after almost a full minute, he quietly answered, "Sometimes corruption isn't people breaking the system." He looked exhausted when he said it, almost hollow. Sometimes corruption is the system. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now, standing inside a Manhattan skyscraper beside a frightened CEO, I finally did. Richard interrupted my thoughts. If Chen found you, then someone else may already know where you are too. Fear settled heavily into my stomach. Not dramatic fear, not panic, something colder. The realization that my quiet, invisible life might have ended the moment I translated that call. I looked toward my cleaning cart near the doorway, the gray plastic bucket, the folded towels, the cheap gloves hanging from the side. For 8 months, that cart protected me. It made me invisible. And invisibility had kept me alive. Now suddenly, people were seeing me again. And that was dangerous. "What does Chen want from me?" I asked quietly. Richard's eyes darkened slightly. "That depends who sent him." Before I could answer, the conference room doors opened again. The same security guard stepped inside, visibly nervous now. "Sir." Richard turned sharply. "Well?" "He refuses to leave." The guard glanced toward me again. "He says she already knows too much." Silence crashed into the room. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. Richard moved fast toward the doors. "Get building security upstairs now." "They're already coming." Richard stopped, then quietly asked the question both of us were afraid of. "Did he threaten her?" The guard hesitated, then nodded once. "He said if she leaves this building alone tonight, she'll disappear like her husband did." Cold spread violently through my chest. For several seconds, the room disappeared around me. All I could hear was Jian's voice from years ago. "If anything happens to me, disappear. Not fight, not tell the police. Disappear." Because somewhere deep down, he already knew the system protecting dangerous people was larger than the system protecting us. Richard rubbed one hand across his face hard, the first visible crack in his composure all night. Then he looked at me. "You cannot go home tonight." I stared at him in disbelief. "You think I'm staying with you?" "That's not what I said." "Then what exactly are you saying?" Richard walked closer slowly, not threatening, not aggressive, but intense, focused. "I'm saying someone spent 4 years believing you were gone." His voice lowered further. "And tonight they discovered they were wrong." The room suddenly felt unbearably cold. I remembered arriving in America after Jian's death with 2 suitcases and almost no money, no family, no support, no future plans, just survival. I cleaned motel rooms in Queens first, then hospital hallways in Brooklyn. Eventually, this company hired me for overnight maintenance because nobody asks many questions about quiet immigrants willing to work impossible hours. I built my life around invisibility, and now invisibility was collapsing around me, piece by piece. The security guard cleared his throat nervously. "There's something else." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What?" The guard looked uneasy now. He asked me to give her this. From his pocket, the guard pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. My heartbeat slowed painfully, because somehow, before even touching it, I already knew the handwriting belonged to Jian. "No," I whispered automatically. "Impossible." Jean had been dead for 4 years. The guard handed me the paper carefully. My hands shook as I unfolded it. One short sentence was written in Mandarin, not typed, written, in Jian's handwriting. "If Richard Bennett says he tried to help me, do not believe him." The blood drained from my face instantly, slowly. I lifted my eyes toward Richard, and for the first time since this night began, I no longer knew which man I should fear more. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. I kept staring at the note in my trembling hands while rain battered the windows behind us. If Richard Bennett says he tried to help me, do not believe him. Jian's handwriting, not similar, not close, Exactly his. Every curve of the letters, every sharp angle in the strokes. My husband's handwriting. The same handwriting from grocery lists taped to our refrigerator in Shanghai, from anniversary cards, from late-night notes left beside my tea when he worked through the night. My chest tightened so painfully I thought I might collapse. "That's impossible," I whispered. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the paper. For the first time since I met him, he looked genuinely shaken. "Where did he get this?" he asked the guard sharply. The guard immediately straightened. "I don't know, sir. The man just handed it to me downstairs." "Did he say anything else?" The guard hesitated, then quietly answered, "He said she was never meant to see that message unless the wrong person found her first." The room went silent again. A cold wave moved slowly through my entire body. Wrong person. I slowly lifted my eyes toward Richard. He noticed immediately, and suddenly the air between us changed, because for the first time tonight, I was no longer afraid only of invisible people outside the building. Now I was afraid of the man standing directly in front of me. Richard stepped toward me slowly. "May." I instinctively moved back. Tiny movement. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. Powerful men always notice fear. "I need you to think carefully," he said quietly. "When exactly did Jian write this note?" "I don't know. Try." Anger suddenly rose through my confusion. My husband died 4 years ago. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." "Then explain how a dead man's handwriting just appeared downstairs in Manhattan." The security guard shifted uncomfortably near the door. Even he looked frightened now. Richard rubbed one hand slowly across his mouth before answering. "There are possibilities." "What possibilities?" His eyes met mine directly. Jian may have prepared messages in advance. I stared at him. "You think he expected to die?" Richard didn't answer immediately, and that silence was answer enough. The realization hit me slowly, horribly. Jian knew, at least partially. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was in danger long before the accident happened. I suddenly remembered a night 6 months before his death. We'd been eating dinner on the apartment balcony in Shanghai while the city lights reflected across the river below. Jian barely touched his food that night. He kept checking his phone. Finally, I asked him, "Are you in trouble?" He smiled immediately, too quickly. "No." But later, after he fell asleep beside me, I saw his laptop screen still glowing on the desk, and on it, a document filled with names, transfers, companies, account numbers. At the top of the file were 2 words in English, Blackstone Holdings. At the time, it meant nothing to me. Now my hands felt ice cold. I looked toward Richard carefully. "You knew Jian was investigating your company," Richard answered without hesitation. "Yes." "You said you respected him." "I did." "Then why is he dead?" The question landed heavily between us. The security guard looked down immediately. Even the storm outside seemed quieter now. Richard's expression hardened slightly, because he underestimated what he was involved in. "That's not an answer. It's the truth." His voice sharpened for the first time all night, not loud, but controlled frustration. I stepped closer toward him despite my fear. "No. The truth is that every time I ask who killed my husband, you answer like a lawyer instead of a human being." Something flickered in Richard's face. Pain. Gone almost immediately. But real. And somehow that frightened me even more. Because emotionally controlled people become unpredictable the moment real emotion breaks through. Richard lowered his voice again. "If I wanted your husband dead, May..." He paused. "You would never have survived long enough to clean this building." The sentence chilled me instantly, not because it sounded like a threat, because it sounded factual, and deep down, I believed him. The room became unbearably quiet. I looked down at Jian's note again. Do not believe him. Simple words, but suddenly every direction felt dangerous. Trust Richard? Dangerous. Trust the mysterious man downstairs? Possibly worse. Trust nobody? Impossible. I suddenly felt exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like the ground beneath my life kept shifting every few minutes. The security guard cleared his throat softly. "Sir, building security wants to know whether they should remove the man from the lobby." Richard's eyes stayed on me. "No." The answer came instantly. The guard looked surprised. Richard continued quietly, "Bring him upstairs." Every muscle in my body tightened. What? Richard didn't look away from me. If Chen came all this way, then he wants something specific. Fear crawled sharply through my chest. "You're inviting him here. He already found you. Running changes nothing now." I hated that he was probably right. The guard hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" Richard finally turned toward him. "Yes." The guard nodded uneasily and left the room again. The moment the doors closed, I turned toward Richard. "You think this is safe?" "No." The honesty of the answer stunned me. Richard loosened his tie slightly again, then walked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. For several seconds, he simply stared at the city below. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded distant. "Do you know what the worst part of power is, May?" I said nothing. Richard continued anyway. "People think power protects them." Thunder rolled faintly outside. "But real power doesn't protect anyone." He turned slowly toward me. "It traps them." Something about the way he said it felt deeply personal, not philosophical, experienced. And suddenly I realized something unsettling. Richard Bennett was afraid too. Not nervous, not stressed. Afraid. The realization changed the room completely, because men like Richard only fear things larger than themselves. I folded my arms tightly. "What exactly are you involved in?" Richard gave a faint, bitter smile. "The kind of financial structure where nobody fully controls the machine anymore." I frowned. "What does that even mean?" "It means corruption grows larger than the people who created it." The answer lingered heavily between us, and before I could respond, the conference room doors opened again, but this time, the older Asian man entered alone. Gray coat, calm face, no umbrella, exactly as I remembered him from Shanghai, 4 years older, but unchanged. His eyes landed on me immediately, not emotional, not relieved, assessing. Then slowly, he looked toward Richard Bennett, and for the first time all night, I saw genuine hatred in someone's eyes. The room became deathly silent the moment Chen Guoliang entered. Even the storm outside seemed distant now. Richard Bennett stood near the windows overlooking Manhattan, while Chen remained beside the conference room doors, rainwater still dripping slowly from the shoulders of his gray coat onto the polished floor. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. These two men already knew each other, not casually, not professionally, deeply, dangerously. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at one another across the conference room like two people remembering a war nobody else survived. Then finally Chen's eyes shifted toward me again, older now, sharper, unreadable. "You should not have translated that call tonight," he said quietly in Mandarin. Hearing my own language spoken so naturally after hours of tension nearly broke something inside me, not because it comforted me, because it reminded me how far from home I really was. I swallowed carefully. You told me to disappear. Chen nodded once. And you should have stayed, disappeared. The sentence landed heavily in my chest. Richard spoke coldly from across the room. You don't get to lecture anyone about safety. Chen's expression never changed. No, he answered quietly. Only consequences. The hatred between them felt old, layered, built over years of things I still didn't understand. I looked between them slowly. What is happening? Neither man answered immediately, and suddenly I realized something horrifying. Both of them were deciding how much truth I was allowed to hear, just like before, just like with Jian. Men in rooms deciding which information women could survive knowing. Anger rose sharply through me. My husband died because everyone kept hiding the truth. Chen finally looked directly at me again. No, he said softly. Your husband died because he stopped understanding fear. The answer stunned me, not because it sounded cruel, because it sounded sad, deeply sad. Richard crossed his arms tightly. Don't romanticize this now. Chen ignored him completely. Instead, he stepped farther into the room toward me, not threatening, careful, measured, like approaching someone already standing near the edge of panic. Jian believed exposing corruption would destroy the people responsible, Chen said quietly. He thought evidence created justice. A faint, bitter smile touched his face. He was still young enough to believe systems wanted truth. I stared at him. And you didn't? No. The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without emotion, just certainty built from experience. Thunder rolled across Manhattan again while the city lights flickered faintly through the rain behind us. I suddenly remembered Jian standing beside our apartment kitchen one night, whispering into his phone while he thought I was asleep. They're not investigators anymore, he said quietly. They're managers. At the time, the sentence meant nothing to me. Now every memory was rearranging itself into something darker. Richard finally moved away from the windows. You shouldn't have come here. Chen looked toward him calmly. You shouldn't have involved her company. Richard's jaw tightened. Blackstone wasn't supposed to be active again. Nothing stays buried forever. The room fell silent once more. I felt like I was standing inside a conversation that began years before I entered it. A conversation about money, power, fear, control, and somewhere inside it, Jian had died. I looked at Chen carefully. Did my husband know he was going to be killed? Neither man answered immediately. That terrified me, because silence is often more honest than words. Finally, Chen spoke quietly. I think Jian understood too late that he had uncovered something larger than corruption. Cold spread slowly through me. What does that mean? Chen's eyes remained fixed on mine. It means governments, corporations, banks, intelligence channels, and private investors stopped being separate systems years ago. The room suddenly felt too small, too airless. I looked toward Richard. You said this was about illegal transfers, Richard answered carefully. It started that way. Chen gave a faint, humorless laugh. It always starts small. Then his eyes hardened slightly, until money begins buying silence instead of products. A horrible realization slowly formed in my chest. You're saying people were murdered over financial transactions. Neither man denied it. The silence after that realization felt unbearable. I suddenly remembered the funeral, the closed casket, the officials speaking too carefully, the way several of Jian's colleagues refused to meet my eyes afterward. At the time, I believed grief explained their behavior. Now I understood fear probably explained more. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "So why am I alive?" Chen answered this time. "Because Jian loved you." The simplicity of the answer hurt more than anything else tonight. For a moment, memories overwhelmed me again. Jian making tea while humming softly in our apartment kitchen. Jian apologizing for coming home late. Jian falling asleep on the couch surrounded by documents he should never have touched. A good man. Not perfect, but good. And suddenly grief hit me all over again. Not fresh, but deeper. Because now I understood he died terrified. Richard spoke quietly from behind me. "He tried to remove your name from everything." I turned sharply toward him. "What?" Richard's face looked exhausted now. "He erased connections to you before he died." Chen nodded once in agreement. "Your husband understood one important thing before the end." I waited silently. Chen's voice lowered further. "The only way to protect you was to make you disappear with him." Tears burned behind my eyes instantly. Not dramatic tears. The kind grief creates when love reveals itself years too late. I remembered fighting with Jian during his final months because he became distant, secretive, distracted. I thought he was emotionally abandoning our marriage. Now I realized he was probably trying desperately to save my life. The weight of that realization nearly crushed me. Richard suddenly spoke again, which means someone discovering her tonight changes everything. Chen's expression darkened immediately. Yes. Fear returned sharply into the room. Immediate. Heavy. I looked between them. Who exactly is looking for me? Chen and Richard exchanged one long, unreadable glance, and in that moment, I understood something terrifying. Even these men were afraid to say certain names aloud. Finally, Chen answered quietly, "People who no longer care who disappears as long as the money keeps moving." Thunder shook the windows hard enough to make the glass vibrate. Then Chen reached slowly into his coat pocket. Richard immediately stiffened, but Chen only removed a small flash drive. Black. Unmarked. My pulse quickened instantly. Chen held it toward me. Jian left this hidden in Singapore. The room seemed to stop breathing. Richard's face changed immediately. Actual alarm. And suddenly I knew this tiny object mattered more than everything else tonight combined. I stared at the flash drive without touching it. "What is it?" Chen looked directly into my eyes and quietly answered, "The reason your husband died." For several seconds, I could not force myself to touch the flash drive. It rested in Chen Guoliang's outstretched hand like something alive, small, silent, ordinary, and somehow more frightening than everything else that had happened tonight. Rain crashed harder against the skyscraper windows, while distant thunder rolled above Manhattan. The conference room lights suddenly felt too bright, too sharp. I stared at the black drive while my pulse pounded painfully in my throat. "The reason your husband died." Chen's words kept echoing inside my head. Richard Bennett stepped forward immediately. "May, don't take it." His voice came fast this time, not calm anymore, not controlled, urgent. Chen looked toward him coldly. "You're still trying to manage the situation." "I'm trying to keep her alive." Those are not always the same thing. The tension between them felt unbearable now, like two men arguing beside an open grave. I finally looked at Richard. "Do you know what's on it?" A brief pause. Then, "Yes." The answer terrified me instantly because he didn't deny it, didn't pretend ignorance. He knew. My fingers curled slowly against my palms. What exactly did Jian leave behind? Neither man answered immediately, and once again I realized something awful. every truth tonight arrived in fragments, carefully rationed, carefully controlled, like even now they feared saying too much aloud. Finally, Chen lowered his hand slightly. Your husband copied transaction archives connected to private transfer channels. I frowned weakly. That doesn't explain murder. Chen's eyes darkened. No, he said quietly. It explains panic. The room fell silent again. I remembered Jian sitting awake beside me during his final months, staring into darkness while he thought I was sleeping. At the time, I believed stress was exhausting him. Now I wondered whether he already understood he was running out of time. Richard spoke carefully. Jian uncovered names attached to the transfers. Something about his tone changed, subtle, heavier. Names that were never supposed to appear together in the same system. Fear tightened through my chest. What kind of names? Chen answered this time. Government officials, intelligence intermediaries, banking executives, political donors. My stomach turned. Richard added quietly, and people wealthy enough to erase problems permanently. The room suddenly felt freezing cold despite the expensive climate-controlled air. I stared toward the rain-covered windows, trying to process the scale of what they were describing. This wasn't corruption anymore, not in the ordinary sense. This sounded like an invisible structure powerful enough to survive governments changing, a machine larger than laws, larger than companies, larger than truth itself, and Jian somehow tried to expose it. Tears burned behind my eyes again, not only grief now, understanding, because suddenly I could see my husband's final year clearly. The exhaustion, the paranoia, the emotional distance. He wasn't abandoning me emotionally. He was carrying terror alone. Chen stepped closer carefully. Jian intended to release the archive if something happened to him. I looked at the flash drive again. Then why didn't he? Neither man answered immediately. Richard finally spoke softly. Because he realized releasing it publicly would not destroy the system. I frowned. Then what would it do? Richard's expression hardened. It would start a war between people powerful enough to destroy anyone near the evidence. The answer hit me hard, because suddenly Jian's final choices made sense. Hide the evidence. Hide me. Disappear. Not justice. Survival. I suddenly felt nauseous. All these years I hated him a little for becoming emotionally distant before he died, and now I realized he was probably trying desperately not to drag me into his fear. My voice shook slightly. He knew they might kill him. Chen answered quietly, yes. The simplicity of the answer nearly broke me. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The storm outside continued raging while Manhattan glowed beneath us like another universe entirely. A city full of strangers eating dinner, laughing in restaurants, riding taxis home, completely unaware of the invisible systems moving beneath their lives. I looked at Richard again. You said Blackstone was involved. Richard nodded once. To a degree. Chen gave a cold laugh. That's a very corporate way to describe laundering geopolitical money. Richard's eyes hardened immediately. And moral outrage from you is ridiculous. The hatred between them deepened instantly, not emotional hatred. Worse, the kind built from shared guilt. I suddenly understood neither man was innocent. Not fully. Maybe there were no innocent people left anywhere near this story. That realization hurt more than I expected, because people survive grief by simplifying the dead into heroes and the living into villains. But reality rarely stays that clean. I looked down at the flash drive again. If this thing is so dangerous, Why give it to me? Chen's face changed slightly then. For the first time tonight, I saw something almost human beneath his coldness. Fatigue. Because Jian trusted you. The answer hit me harder than I expected. Richard turned sharply toward Chen. That's exactly why she should never open it. My eyes moved between them. You both keep talking about me like I'm not standing here. Chen ignored Richard completely. Your husband believed you would know what to do. A painful laugh escaped me before I could stop it. No, I whispered. You didn't know Jian the way I did. Both men looked at me silently. I folded my arms tighter around myself. My husband married a woman who avoids conflict at restaurants because she feels guilty sending food back. Tears blurred my vision now. He married someone who cleans office floors because surviving quietly felt easier than remembering who she used to be. The room stayed silent. I looked at the flash drive again. And now suddenly everyone expects me to decide what happens with something powerful enough to get people killed. Chen's voice softened slightly. Because you are the last person Jian trusted completely. That sentence shattered something inside me, not dramatically, quietly, like grief finally finding the exact place to land after years of wandering. I remembered the final morning I saw Jian alive. He kissed my forehead distractedly while searching for documents inside his briefcase. I had been angry because he canceled dinner plans again. Before leaving, he paused near the apartment door, then came back unexpectedly and held me for several extra seconds. At the time, it felt strange. Now tears rolled silently down my face. Maybe that wasn't affection. Maybe that was goodbye. Richard noticed my expression immediately. His voice lowered. May. But before he could continue, every screen inside the conference room suddenly turned black. At the exact same moment, the overhead lights flickered once, then twice. Chen's entire posture changed instantly. Sharp, alert. Someone's inside the system. Richard moved toward the nearest monitor, fast. What? The screen flashed suddenly. White text appeared across the black display. Transfer archive activated. My blood went cold. Chen looked directly at Richard. You told me the files were buried. Richard's face had gone completely pale. They were. Then another line appeared on the screens. Access location detected room 42C. Silence crashed into the conference room, and slowly, all three of us realized the same horrifying thing at once. Someone already knew exactly where we were. Chast 910 in. Nobody moved. The glowing text on the conference room screens reflected across the polished black table, while thunder rolled above Manhattan like distant artillery. Access location detected room 42C. For several long seconds, all three of us simply stared at the monitors. Then Richard Bennett moved first. Fast. He grabbed his phone from the table and dialed someone immediately. No outbound systems, he said sharply the moment the call connected. Shut down every external server route now. Whoever answered him must have pushed back because Richard's face darkened instantly. I don't care what it interrupts. Do it. He ended the call and looked toward Chen. You said the archive was isolated. It was. Well, somebody just activated it. Chen's expression remained controlled, but I could see something changing behind his eyes now. Concern. Real concern. And suddenly I understood the terrifying truth. Even Chen did not fully understand who was controlling this anymore. Rain slammed violently against the windows while the screens continued glowing across the room. Transfer archive activated. The words looked unreal, like something from another person's life, not mine. I was supposed to finish my overnight shift, ride the subway home, heat instant noodles in my apartment kitchen, and fall asleep beside the hum of old pipes in my building. That was my life. Quiet, small, safe. Or at least I thought it was. Now I was standing between two men who looked like they'd spent years surviving something invisible and monstrous, and somehow, Gian had known all of this before he died. My chest tightened painfully again. I looked at Richard. What happens if someone accesses the archive? Neither man answered immediately. That silence was enough. Fear crawled slowly through my stomach. Finally, Richard spoke quietly. If the full transfer records become public, he stopped, choosing words carefully. Financial systems in multiple countries could collapse overnight. I stared at him. You're saying bank records can destroy governments? Chen answered coldly. Not governments. His eyes shifted toward the flashing screen. People. The room suddenly felt airless. Richard moved quickly toward one of the monitors, typing commands into the system. Nothing changed. The message remained frozen across the display. Then another line suddenly appeared underneath. Live trace initiated. Chen swore quietly in Mandarin. Richard's jaw tightened hard. What does that mean? I asked. Neither answered immediately. Then Chen looked directly at me. It means whoever activated the archive is trying to locate every remaining person connected to it. Cold spread violently through my body. Connected. My husband, Richard, Chen, and now, me. I instinctively stepped backward. No. The word escaped before I could stop it. This has nothing to do with me. But even saying it sounded weak now. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. The moment Gian married me, the moment he tried to protect me, the moment he erased my name from official systems, I became part of it too. Richard suddenly looked at me sharply. The flash drive. I looked down at the small black device still in my hand. I had forgotten I was holding it. Give it to me. Chen moved instantly. No. The force in his voice shocked the room. Richard turned toward him coldly. She doesn't understand what she's carrying. And you think you should control it? At least I know how these people operate. Chen stepped closer. So did Gian. The room exploded into silence again. That name still carried weight between them. Heavy weight, shared history, shared guilt. I looked between both men while my pulse hammered painfully in my ears. For 4 years, I whispered, I thought my husband died in an accident. Neither spoke. For 4 years, I blamed myself because our last conversation was an argument about him working too much. My throat tightened. I spent years wondering if he stopped loving me before he died. The confession hung quietly in the room, painfully human beneath all this machinery of money and fear. Chen's expression softened slightly. Richard looked away, and suddenly anger surged through me harder than fear. Not screaming anger, something colder, clearer. You both knew pieces of the truth. Neither denied it. You let me spend 4 years burying him alone while all of you protected systems and companies and secrets. Richard spoke quietly. It wasn't that simple. No, I snapped. My husband died terrified and alone. The storm outside shook the windows again. I looked at Richard directly. You respected him? My eyes burned. Then why was I left with nothing except lies? For the first time since tonight began, Richard Bennett looked ashamed, not defensive, not corporate, ashamed. The realization stunned me. He lowered his eyes briefly before speaking, because after Gian died, people started disappearing. Silence. Chen folded his arms tightly. Richard continued quietly. investigators, account managers, auditors. His voice became lower. One journalist in Hong Kong. Fear moved slowly through the room again. Richard looked directly at me. If people believed Jian left evidence connected to you, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I finally understood. The lie protected me. The silence protected me. My invisible life protected me. And tonight, all of it had shattered. Suddenly, every screen in the conference room flickered violently. The lights dimmed once. Then the main monitor changed again. A new message appeared across the black display. Archive key detected. My blood froze, because at the exact same moment, everybody in the room looked down at the flash drive in my hand. Chen's face changed instantly. No. Richard stepped toward me fast. May, don't connect that drive to anything. But before anyone could move further, the conference room doors suddenly unlocked with a loud electronic click. Then slowly, someone began opening them from the outside. The conference room doors opened slowly. Every instinct inside me screamed to run, but there was nowhere left to run anymore. The storm outside raged over Manhattan while the electronic locks clicked softly behind the opening doors. Richard Bennett stepped in front of me instantly, protective, automatic, and somehow that frightened me almost as much as the danger itself, because men only protect things they cannot afford to lose. The doors finally opened completely. 3 people entered the room, 2 men in dark suits, and between them, a woman, mid-50s, silver black hair pulled neatly behind her head, elegant charcoal coat untouched by rain, calm, terrifyingly calm. The moment Chen saw her, something changed in his face. Not surprise, recognition, old recognition. The woman's eyes moved slowly across the room before settling on me, and suddenly I felt examined in a way I never had before, not as a janitor, not as a widow, as a variable, a surviving variable. No weapons, the woman said quietly. One of the men behind her immediately stopped near the doorway. Richard's voice turned cold. You shouldn't be here. The woman ignored him completely. Instead, she looked directly at the flash drive in my hand. So, she said softly, Jian really trusted his wife after all. Hearing my husband's name from a stranger's mouth felt deeply wrong, painful, personal. I tightened my grip on the drive. Who are you? The woman studied me silently for a moment before answering. My name is Evelyn Ward. The name clearly meant something to Richard and Chen. Richard's entire body stiffened. Chen's expression darkened immediately. And suddenly I understood. This woman stood above both of them. Not politically, not publicly, structurally. Like someone existing higher inside the invisible machine they'd both been describing all night. Evelyn stepped farther into the room. No one here actually controls what's happening anymore, she said calmly. That is the tragedy of systems built on fear. Thunder shook softly through the skyscraper windows. I stared at her. My husband was murdered because of that system. For the first time all evening, someone answered me directly. Yes. The word hit harder than I expected. No hesitation, no softened language, no corporate phrasing, just truth. My knees almost weakened beneath me. 4 years. 4 years waiting for certainty, and now it arrived in a single word. Tears burned instantly behind my eyes. Richard looked away. Chen lowered his gaze briefly, but Evelyn continued calmly, almost gently. Your husband discovered financial structures connecting private capital to state operations across multiple countries. She paused. He believed exposure would destroy the network. A faint sadness crossed her expression. He underestimated how dependent the modern world had already become on it. I stared at her through blurred vision. You're talking about corruption like it's necessary. Evelyn's eyes remained steady. No, I'm talking about reality. The answer filled me with sudden anger. My husband died for reality? He died because he believed truth should matter more than stability. Silence, heavy, endless. The city lights flickered below us like another universe entirely. I remembered Jian standing barefoot in our apartment kitchen at midnight while making tea. The soft sound of rain outside the balcony doors. The way he smiled tiredly whenever I complained he worked too much. Ordinary moments, small moments. And suddenly grief hit me differently than before. Not sharp, not explosive, worse, permanent. Because now I finally understood. Jian knew he might never come home long before the night he died, and he loved me enough to hide that fear from me. My tears finally slipped down my face silently. I looked toward Evelyn. Why am I still alive? The room became very quiet. Evelyn answered carefully this time. Because someone inside the network intervened after Jian's death. My eyes slowly shifted toward Richard. He said nothing, but silence answered for him. A painful realization spread through me. Richard had protected me, not completely, not innocently, but enough to keep me invisible, enough to keep me alive. Chen spoke quietly. He erased your connections from internal systems. Richard finally looked at me again. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked exhausted beyond words. Jian asked me to. The room seemed to stop breathing. What? Richard swallowed once before continuing. 2 days before he died, he contacted me privately. My chest tightened painfully. He knew people inside the transfers had started panicking. Richard's voice lowered. He said if anything happened to him, you could not become part of the fallout. I could barely breathe now, because suddenly I could hear Jian's voice in my memory again. If anything happens, disappear. Not fear. Love. Everything he did at the end had been love disguised as distance, and I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. Evelyn's voice interrupted softly. The archive, May. I looked down at the flash drive in my trembling hand. The entire room seemed to revolve around that tiny object. Years of secrets, money, fear, deaths, all hidden there. Richard stepped toward me carefully. If that archive goes public, people will die. Chen answered immediately. People already died. Neither man was entirely wrong. That was the horror of it. There were no clean endings left, no perfect justice, only consequences. Evelyn folded her hands calmly in front of her. You now possess something every person in this room fears. I stared at her. What happens if I destroy it? Chen looked shocked. Richard looked relieved. But Evelyn almost smiled. A very human answer. I looked toward the rain outside the windows. For years, I survived by becoming invisible, by cleaning around powerful people without existing to them. And yet tonight, every powerful person in this room was waiting for my decision. Mine. Not theirs. Mine. I thought about Jian, about fear, about grief, about truth. And suddenly, I realized something quietly devastating. My husband died trying to fight a machine too large for one person to destroy. But he also died believing goodness still mattered. If I buried the archive forever, then his death became only silence. If I released everything blindly, more innocent people could disappear. For the first time in years, I stopped feeling like someone hiding from life. I lifted my eyes slowly toward Richard. You once asked why someone with my background cleans office floors. The room stayed silent. I wiped tears from my face carefully. Because after Jian died, surviving felt smaller than living. Thunder rolled softly above Manhattan. Then I looked at Chen. You said Jian stopped understanding fear. Finally, I looked toward Evelyn. And maybe all of you forgot something worse. The woman studied me quietly. I tightened my grip around the flash drive. Fear is not the same thing as conscience. Silence filled the room, real silence, the kind that changes people. Then slowly, I walked toward the conference room fireplace. Richard immediately understood. May. But I kept walking. The gas flames flickered softly behind the glass, warm, steady, final. For one long moment, I held the flash drive in my hand and thought about everything hidden inside it. Then I whispered quietly, almost to Jian himself, I won't let them turn your life into another weapon. And I dropped the drive into the fire. Richard closed his eyes instantly. Chen stared in shock. Evelyn remained completely still. The plastic melted slowly beneath the flames, years of secrets disappearing into heat and smoke. No headlines, no revolution, no public victory. Only one woman deciding that grief would end with her instead of consuming the world around her. Tears rolled silently down my face as the storm outside finally began to weaken. And for the first time in 4 years, I no longer felt invisible. I felt free.